between what I would call a pork chop solution and an apple pie solution to any particular problem. The question is, what is the difference between a pork chop solution and an apple pie solution? Well, the difference is that an apple pie, when you make it, can be more or less good, bad, or indifferent. Depends how good a cook you are, depends how lucky you were on that particular day, depends what the apples were like, etc. But whatever happens, it's not likely to be dramatic. On the other hand, a pork chop can sometimes, if it's not made properly or treated properly, kill you. You've got to be extremely careful. Now, too often, when we think of problems in education, we think of what I would call pork chop solutions. That is, if you had the 10 best teachers in the world and an unlimited amount of money and the most brilliant children, this would all work. The problem is you never do have unlimited amounts of money, the 10 best kids in the world, the best teachers, the best everything, the best communities. What you have is a mixture, good news and bad news. And so as you think about responding to the challenges of the future, you have to think of apple pie solutions, ones that work when conditions aren't terrific. Now, when conditions are terrific, they work better. When conditions aren't terrific, at least they work. In moving around to the various schools of the province of Ontario primarily, I have two anecdotes to close with. One has to do with walking into a French language school, an elementary school. And I had been a bit late. I'd been at the secondary school in this board, and I was a bit delayed, so they were obviously waiting for me a bit impatiently. And when I walked into the foyer of the school, there was a welcoming committee. There was a principal, the assistant principal, there was the chairperson of the Parents Association, and then one kid, I think from each class in the school. But they were certainly organized by height, so they looked like sort of this when you walked in. Anyway, I was introduced to the adults, and the students then introduced themselves to me. And each time, starting with the oldest, or the tallest at least, each time someone introduced themselves, they also gave me a gift. And it was usually a picture they'd drawn, or a paragraph they'd written, or a poem they'd done in school, probably the previous day or that morning, I don't know. Anyway, I get down to the young lady in kindergarten. Of course, this is all going on in French. And she says, Dr. Shapiro, she says, I love you. Well, I probably smiled stupidly or something like that. I don't know what I did. But anyway, I said, well, you seem like a very nice young girl to me. And she said, well, she said, my teacher spoke to me. So I know this is not a question of free will. This is my teacher spoke to me business. And she said, I have a gift for you. I said, well, isn't that nice? And she had something in her hand, a piece of paper like this, I suppose. And she went to give it to me. I put my hand out to take it. She said, but she said, I'd really rather give it to my mother. So I said, well, that seems like a very good idea. And she said, good, took it back and went back into line. Now, in the next community, which was North Bay, as a matter of fact, a couple of days later, I was having lunch in the high school with two representatives of each of the student councils in the North Bay system. And we'd had lunch together and talked about a bunch of different things. And then they had been told, apparently in advance, I don't know whose idea this was, but anyway, they'd been told in advance that each school, each pair, could ask the deputy minister one question. And anyway, they went through a variety of questions, all which seemed to me to have been carefully prepared by the faculty advisors, actually. But nevertheless, one young girl from a elementary school finally said something. She said, well, she said, do deputy ministers live in palaces? So I said no. And she said, well, where do you live? And so I said, well, I live in an apartment in downtown Toronto. And she said, oh, she said, even I don't have to live in an apartment. Now, I mention the stories partly because they're fun to recall, and partly because a message comes across, which is with young people that lively and that imaginative, if we don't succeed, we better not look to them as a reason for that outcome. And in some ways, the liveliness and the spirit of those young people reinforce my own faith in the myth of education. Now, there's a national myth. There's also an educational myth. I mean, what is a myth? A myth is something we believe in strongly, but the empirical evidence for which is not entirely convincing. Doesn't mean it's not true. It just means the empirical evidence for it is not entirely convincing. Well, education is in so many ways a myth. We keep thinking it does all of these things. We keep believing it does all of these things, but the empirical evidence for it is not always nearly as convincing as we would like to believe. The challenge for you out of that kind of context is not to find that a source of embarrassment, but to find your, what I hope will be, continuing faith, a source of strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. Thank you for your attention. And now is an opportunity for you to pursue some issues that may have been sparked in your minds by what Dr. Shapiro has shared with us. And I'm going to act as, to the extent I can, as an impartial referee. I'll receive your request for the opportunity to speak. Would you use one of the mics here or here? And it's not so much because you wouldn't be heard otherwise, but because they do want it for the recording, I believe, for the taping. So if you wouldn't mind making known to me your desire to speak, I'll recognize you and you'll use one of the mics to presumably, in most instances, I'm sure, to address questions to Dr. Shapiro, and he's agreed to be available to respond, to extend further, to respond to your questions.
I should say, just while you're thinking about that, lugubrious possibility, apparently, that I'd be glad to respond to questions about things that I hadn't said, things you think I should have talked about but didn't.
Jean Brown?
Is this on? Okay. Dr. Shapiro, I'm in the Division of Learning Resources. Now, a lot of the literature that I read has to do with what is normally called an information age, information explosion, the needs for young people in this kind of an age to develop thinking skills, skills of being able to handle all this information that's bombarding all of us from all sides. I hate to ask you this because I have to do a session immediately afterwards, and your answer might might really cause me grief. I'm hoping that it won't, and but what I really do want to hear, what you, with your experience and what you have said so far, feel about this. Is it as big a problem as it is portrayed, and how do you see it as a challenge for our schools?
Well, in one sense, it's as big a problem as is portrayed, in the sense that in two ways. One is there is, of course, an explosion of knowledge. We just know a lot more about a lot more things, and it increases exponentially every year. So in that sense, it's a problem. And I think that the reason it's particularly a problem in schools is that we've developed this idea that part of the purpose of education in the elementary or secondary schools is coverage. And if ever there was what seems to me a stupid educational idea, it must be the notion of coverage. These endless debates that we have in Ontario about whether we're going to have 2 credits of this and 1 credit of that or 3 of this and so on are just also futile in the information environment. I mean, the object of education in a kind of information environment we're talking about is for a young person to be able to answer the question, what do I do when I know I don't know? Since that's the question they're almost always going to be faced with. That's the question they've got to be. And for that, coverage is simply an irrelevant educational idea. What is a relevant educational idea, of course, is what we might call the more generic either problem-solving or thinking skills. Now, you don't want to go to the other extreme of saying it doesn't matter that you don't know anything as long as you know how to solve a problem, because you don't learn how to solve problems in the abstract. You only learn how to solve problems or how to think in dealing with actual concrete material. The only point I would make is it doesn't matter one heck of a lot which concrete material, which set of concrete material you're dealing with. What matters is that you deal with it imaginatively. Now, the other reason that's so important nowadays hasn't got to do with what goes on in school, but has to do with what goes on after school in the following context. That is, one of the consequences of the internationalization of life, in a sense, is that the old model of an adult life, which is you go to school and then you go to work, whether it's after high school, before high school, after college, whatever it is simply not going to be appropriate any longer. People are going to face many more career shifts in midstream, in general, than they did before. So they will have, in career one, a set of very well-developed skills that suddenly have no buyers in the marketplace. And they're going to, therefore, have to think about how to reorganize themselves for a future. And that's something quite anti-intuitive for many adults at the moment. For example, there is in Ontario, and I'm sorry to use the Ontario example, it's just that I know it, there is an Ontario program that we call Transitions. It's directed at the older worker. And what it provides is that if you're an older worker, defined as somebody 40 or over, who has been laid off for whatever reason, the province will pay for any retraining program you choose to enter. The program was budgeted in the first year at $20 million. And the take-up was 2.5. And as we tried to figure out why is it, we know we've got laid-off workers. We know we've got this money to help them retrain for something new. Why is it that there's no takers? It turns out that in the psychology of Ontario, at least, 40-year-olds don't think of themselves as new potential for the future. Their life, they feel, is behind them. Their careers are behind them. And if that means that they've got to suffer the economic consequences, let's say, of not working, well, then that's what it means. So there's a whole new psychology that's got to be developed in young people as well as in older people. And in that context, as I said before, coverage is simply an irrelevant educational idea. It is important to learn things, but which specific things you learn turn out to have no particular value. It's related to something else I talked about earlier, which is the question of relevance. You know, when I'm talking to a group of young people who are going to university, they don't ask me, why are we studying quadratic equations? Because they don't care about the answer. All they know is in order to get to university, they've got to solve these problems, and so they just do it. It's all relevant to them, not because they care about the content, but because they know what ticket it buys, or the destination it buys a ticket to. However, with the great majority of young people, who are those not going on to post-secondary education, the question of relevance makes a huge difference. And so that has to be kept in mind as well. Apparently, an early morning talk is a little bit like Valium. Or that particular one is a little bit like Valium.
I'm interested, Dr. Shapiro, to hear you comment on the issue that Ontario has faced much more, obviously, than we would be in Newfoundland. And that is the issue of the more pluralistic society, the influx of people from so many various cultures, the dealing with the cultural issues that therefore you're faced with in the educational system. How big a problem does that present? Does it, can we simply look at it as an enriching of our educational system? Do we see it as being a problem? Do we see it as the kind of thing which is very difficult for us to handle?
Well, Ontario may have faced it to a much greater extent than Newfoundland. It hasn't resolved the problem, however. I think that it is both enriching and a problem. I mean, it is both things at the same time. It is terribly, terribly difficult for teachers, for example, to be called upon to deal with a class of students, 2/3 of which speak neither English nor French at home. That is just a very hard thing to do. It's terribly difficult for people like myself to deal with communities whose value orientations are just so opposite, or so different at least, from the ones which I myself am committed to. And so it's, I would say, it's a problem. The challenge, of course, is to make it enriching. I mean, there is something special brought to the environment in the sense there's a breadth of vision, a breadth of understanding that can come out of it. There's a kind of education in tolerance that itself is valuable for its own sake. As we accept people, we don't insist they be like us all the time. And in a multicultural society, of course, tolerance is a supreme civic virtue. In another context, this is a slight aside, but in another context, I once did a royal commission on the funding of private schools. And as part of that, the work I was doing, it was just a one-person commission, so there was a lot of sort of things to do yourself. I decided I would visit a whole range of private schools, most of which, in the Ontario context at least, most of which in general in Canada, are denominational schools of one kind or another. And I visited, I think, 40 or 50 such schools, and I decided in each community in which I visited a private school, I'd visit the local public school to try and get a sense of what the differences were, how the parents perceived them, and things of that sort. Anyway, as I went about this set of trips, I would ask in each school what they were doing in that school to encourage or to make more likely that the young people who were at that school would become tolerant adults, positively tolerant adults. And I found the responses uniformly disappointing. In a private school, they would say, well, we're making people into good Protestants, good Catholics, good Jews, good whatever. And therefore they will be tolerant, which certainly is a defiance of the actual facts. Now in the public schools, however, the very same thing happened. It just was a different response, but it's the same defiance of the facts. They said, well, everybody's welcome here, and so therefore they become tolerant, which is also contradicted by the facts. And so the big challenge, it seems to me, in the multicultural environment, and that is the reality of our street, let's face it, is that we need to focus a very great deal more on how it is you get young people to accept each other even when they're different. And I don't know how to do that. I wish I did know how to do that. It certainly goes beyond the question of talking about ethnic holidays and stuff like that, which I suppose is better than nothing, but not a lot better than nothing. And but it is a little better than nothing. It's got to be much more complex than that. And at the same time, remember the other thing I said, you've got to keep in mind that there are limits to the relativism of Canadian society. There are some things we don't accept as useful or as something we want to reinforce, even if someone actually believes it. Believing something is not a sufficient reason. It may be necessary, but it's not sufficient. The most difficult part of all this in our context comes in terms of language. That is, if you have someone from a Greek home, let's say, do you give them instruction in Greek? And if so, for how long? And the opinion in Ontario varies. Some people say that up until grade 10. Other people say for the first 10 weeks, and then call it a day and just throw them into either the English or the French language environment. We tend to provide third, fourth, fifth language instruction for young people only in the first grade. So that in various areas of Toronto especially, in the larger cities more especially, we have special classes so that the introduction to school is not mixed up with the introduction to a new language, which can be very important. The most extreme example I can think of in this regard is Singapore. I don't know how many of you have been to Singapore, which is a sort of little island state, very artificial, but anyway, there it is, quite successful economically. But the language of instruction in all the Singapore schools is English. It is virtually never the language of the home. The language of the home would be Chinese or Tamil or Malay, most commonly. Now, put that as one. The other side of the situation in Singapore is that they decide when you're 8 years old, in third grade, which track you're going to be in. There's a track that just goes to the end of elementary school, there's a track that goes to the end of high school, there's a track that goes on to university. And that choice is made when the child is 8. Now, since the language of instruction is English, that choice is made more often or not on the ability of the child to handle English, not on the ability of the child to handle learning. And so what middle-class, upwardly mobile parents do desperately with their 3, 4, and 5-year-olds is teach them English. So they don't mix up the learning capacity of the child with their capacity to deal with a particular language. And that's what we're trying in a tentative way not to do, in a sense, in Ontario, by providing some initial instruction in a language with the child is familiar, and at the same time trying to make the transition by the time they go into the 2nd grade. It's I'd say, not a half-hearted attempt. We're serious about it, but we haven't resolved all the problems.
You very quickly said that the question was not really one of different cultures and different languages, but rather differences. And I'm glad you addressed it in the way you did, because in our province, as you are aware of already, I guess we, in some sense, have fallen into the situation where we've got alternatives. And to some degree, people get to then back up and begin questioning the nature of the alternative and whether or not it ought to be.
Yeah. Well, in terms of alternatives, I, in fact, am a big fan of what in Ontario we call, in other places we just have other words, alternative schools. Now, the Ontario system, for those of you who don't know, essentially has 2 publicly funded school systems. There's the Roman Catholic system, and there's the non-denominational system. And that's roughly it for the publicly funded schools. And I've been trying, sort of with some mediocre success, I'd say, to encourage both publicly funded systems to develop alternative schools within them, so that there's a greater choice for parents as a way of expressing their differences of view. And we've had some success. There are about 130 alternative schools in Ontario, about 2/3 of them in the Greater Toronto area. And these range from alternatives that may have to do with a particular type of teaching, like someone who's into Montessori as opposed to someone who isn't, or sometimes it's a linguistic type alternative, sometimes it's an ethnic type alternative. Now, we do insist, however, when alternative schools are offered, they must be open to anybody who wants to attend. We do not allow alternative schools in the system that are exclusive in terms of the people they select, with one exception. And the exception, which is an interesting one to discuss in the sense that I'm not sure it's a good idea, although we do allow it, has to do with academic ability. That is, there are some schools, Scarborough, for example, has developed an academically elite elementary school for very gifted children. It's not only academically elite, it's traditionalist, and to correspond with the fondest wish of my grandparents. As the kids all wear uniforms with hats and stuff like that. And interestingly enough, it seems to be working extremely well. I mean, it's easy enough for me to be snide, but it seems to be working extremely well for the young people who are in it. The effect it has on the other schools is, of course, the problem. But nevertheless, that is the one exception where you're not guaranteed admission. You have to, in this case, have achieved at a certain level in the school system.
Shapiro, I wonder if you would care to comment on a concern that perhaps many of us administrators deal with today, and that is with our teachers on staff who have to respond to so many demands in their regular day to provide perhaps instruction in English as a second language, or to deal with French concerns, to deal with special education and integration, enrichment, all of these which have become part of their normal routine day. And you made one comment which said that in education that we have to encourage students, and I would suggest teachers as well, to feel that they don't only respond to what's happening, but have some control over what's happening. I don't know if I'm quoting you exactly, but that they can affect change themselves and not just have something happen to them as part of the educational process. And I see that as a real issue with teachers. I think that they're in a situation where they feel they have no control over what's happening in their everyday world, teaching situation. Could you comment on teacher professional growth, or how you would address that?
Well, I think, for one thing, I think it's just partly true. I mean, I believe we've overinvested in schools. Not that we spend too much money on them, but we've imagined they'll do too many things. And we're now becoming victims of our own rhetoric, having announced to the world that we were the sort of cathedrals of the 20th century. That is a mechanism through which we would transcend the past in some sort of fascinating way. We're now disappointing ourselves and everyone else at the same time, the fact that we can't deliver. And so I think that the demands made on teachers generally are unreasonable. And there are a number of ways in which it seems to me teachers can respond. One is by what I called before benign neglect. You just don't do it, and wait and see what happens. And if you're at all clever, I think you can often get, whole careers are made out of benign neglect. And I think, but you see, I think that's appropriate to professional. You decide what out of this range of things that people would like you to do is possible to actually accomplish, and you do that. And you ignore the rest and wait for the police, so to speak, and see what happens. Now, you hate to sort of counsel civil disobedience, which is what that amounts to. On the other hand, in the face of what might be unreasonable, it's not a bad strategy. So that's one thing. Because the reason that's important, incidentally, is that nobody who resents what they're doing does it well. So it's much better off to do less and feel good about it and deliver than the other way around. The second kind of strategy is a more political strategy, which I think is worth pursuing. That is, in this case, Newfoundland Teachers Association, or in Ontario, the Ontario Teachers Federation, or whatever, needs, I think, to be very active, not only with regard to what the contract is going to be this year, and what the wages are going to be, and the fringe benefits are going to be, and how the pension arrangements are to work out and stuff like that, but also needs to be able to protect, or needs to work at least, to protect teachers from unreasonable demands on the part of the community. I mean, it's easy enough for me as deputy minister to get a lot done. I keep delegating it to one of the 4,000 people that work for me, and I sit there not doing very much. And that's what communities tend to do relative to schools. I think, however, we've also got an education task at hand. And that is, I think we as educators have to educate the lay communities about what's possible in schools and about what isn't. We can't just keep clasping to our breast every problem that comes up, not only because we don't have the solutions anyway, but because there's just not that much that can be done in any given day. So I think we've got to get out and work inside the lay communities to make their expectations more reasonable and their demands more reasonable. It's interesting, and I don't know if this is true all over Canada, but certainly true in Ontario. In poll after poll we've done, we find that 80% of what people think about schools, they have learned from people employed by the schools. Not, interestingly enough, from the press or from their own children, but from people who work for schools, that is teachers, principals, secretaries, caretakers, whatever. If that's true elsewhere, it's certainly true in Ontario. I don't know if it's true elsewhere. If it's true elsewhere, then that means that we've got to take up the challenge of educating the community and not simply of educating the young people, on the grounds that if we're successful at that, we're much more likely to educate those young people in a way that's appropriate. I think if you are going to be a professional, you do have to be able to make choices. You can't just sit there waiting for the next memorandum from Queen's Park.
I was going to say, may I thank you then for your participation. Maybe I'll say it the other way. May I thank you for your non-participation, but you've listened well, and we've appreciated your attention. Beverly Lemoyne has a final comment. Before she does, I've got a note from George Hickman to say that before Beverly speaks, please remind them, you, to pass in pre-workshop assignment sheets to the office before 11. And you will note, I suspect George has a comment on this, but you will note that the session recommences at 11. Beverly?
Dr. Shapiro, on behalf of all the participants here and the planning committee, we'd like to present you with this token of our appreciation. In trying to plan for the present, for this very moment, we did look to the past, and we visited a place called the Codjigger here in St. John's. Are you familiar with what a Codjigger is, by any chance? Well, that's some research that you'll have to carry out before you leave today. I'm not going to give you the answer. But we did visit the Codjigger, and we bought a gift which represents, I think, our culture, our perseverance, our determination to survive as Newfoundlanders in our unique culture. And that's not at all to suggest that we're not eager to be part of a greater mosaic at all. But we hope that in the future, when you enjoy this, that you'll reflect on the limited time that you've had here. It's unfortunate you can't stay longer, but we certainly do appreciate the contribution that you've made. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
George isn't here, so I'll just proclaim that coffee time is on, eh?